This content is not suitable for children and may contain depictions of violence.
Hi, I'm your host Cambo. Grab a beer and pull up a deck chair. This is True Crime Island, another true crime podcast. So Islanders, how are you all? I hope you're well. Now, just a note before we start. I mentioned the other episode about being involved in the Missing in Michigan event. Well, I need to put a little bit of effort into it in the next coming weeks. So I may or may not have another case next week, but it is for a good cause, and I will give you more details about the event, which it will be a virtual event, in the next episode in 2 weeks' time, but there may still be another episode next week. I do have one script up my sleeve. Now, this week's case is one I heard about ages ago, and I recently saw a short bit of it on YouTube, so I thought you might like to hear about it. Tonight we go to Nodaway County in the tiny town of Skidmore, Missouri, where the town bully is finally stood up to. Now, references tonight are from the Times Advocate in California, NodawayNews.com, PriceFuneralHomeMaryville.com, In Broad Daylight, the book by Harry N. McLean, recommended, Missouri County Marriage Naturalization, and from Court Records. Now, this episode has a bit of a trigger warning, maybe a severe trigger warning, and I won't be going into detail of what he does until the end part where he's permanently silenced by the town folks. More the trigger warning is because he's probably up there with Jimmy Savile when it comes to children. In 1981, Skidmore, Missouri, it had a population of around 440 people. It had a bank, fuel station, post office, grain silo and a tavern, but nothing much else. Today its population is barely half it was back in 1981, and gone are most of the shops. But if you street view through the area now, it looks like you can still at least fill your car with fuel and maybe post a letter. Now, the story I'll be telling you tonight probably has something to do with the fact that the population's probably only half that now. It's a story of how a whole town turned vigilante on the town bully, Ken McElroy. Now, McElroy, or McElroy, a lot of people say, I reckon it's McElroy, was born in 1934 on a farm not far from the centre of town. Now, he was the 15th of 16 kids in a very poor family, and I'm saying dirt poor. His father often worked for other landowners, but eventually the family purchased their own land. However, they all lived in a tiny 2-bedroom house, all 18 of them, or how many were still left at home. When he was young, he fell off a hay wagon, which required him to have a metal plate to be implanted in his head. Now, he was a tall bloke, 6'3", jet black hair that he slicked back, and he had these Elvis sideburns. In his later years, he would get to around 270 pounds or around 135 kilos, so he was a pretty big, intimidating guy. For such a quiet, serene rural area, McElroy certainly made his meanness known. And mean, that's a word that just keeps popping up when people describe McElroy. He was more than mean. He was someone that even the biggest and the toughest of the town avoided. When others spoke of Ken McElroy, they would often say, don't ever trust him. Don't ever turn your back on him. Now, from what I can see, McElroy became trouble from around 13 years of age. He was held back twice in the 5th grade, so as you can imagine at that age, being 2 years older than other kids, and he was a big bloke, it would have been much taller, much bigger than the other kids around him. Now, McElroy was a bully at school, and most kids avoided him, but even the bigger and older kids. He wouldn't fist fight, he'd pull a knife, in his older years, if it wasn't a knife, it was a gun. The only exception was that he was happy to use his fists only on his girlfriends and his wives. Now, McElroy was just a petty thief. Once when a shopkeeper called his dad to tell him that Ken had stolen something, his dad went to the shop with a knife and threatened the shopkeeper. Now, this is probably where McElroy learnt how to deal with people. Look, he had very little parental supervision and basically did what he wanted. McElroy left school in the 9th grade after hitting the principal and getting expelled. He and his little brother Tim would steal grain, fuel for their cars, and even strip cars for parts that they needed for their own car. Now, they were never caught, and the brothers then progressed to stealing cattle, pigs, and breaking into houses and stealing antiques. The incidence of cattle rustling in Skidmore at the time was about 6 times the national average, with McElroy often having rolls of $100 notes in his pockets, even though he seemed to have no job or no other apparent way to make that sort of money. Now, it was quite difficult to get busted stealing livestock back then, maybe now, because the law at the time was that it wasn't a requirement to brand or tag your animals. So unless you were caught red-handed stealing livestock, you had to rely on the owner describing each animal to prove it was theirs. So if you had 500 cows, it's pretty hard to be able to say, hey, that's my Daisy the cow over there with the big brown eyes and the patch over her face. It's just so difficult. McElroy, apparently he did make some of his income leasing land near his farm. I call bullshit on that. But he did make some money trading and racing dogs. Amongst the dog racing community, he was well respected and he knew his stuff. And I think that's the only place he ever behaved himself. However, he would pick on poor people, not rich ones that had lawyers. Now, Ken had a lawyer himself, Richard McFadden, and he was a good lawyer, being able to get McElroy off the hook 20 times and nearly off the hook one final time. He not only stole livestock and guns, but he also stole chemicals that farmers used on their farms. A warehouse that housed some of this very new and expensive chemical had been broken into. The next night, it got broken into again. The proprietors decided to get a security guard armed with a shotgun to protect the place, thinking it's probably going to get broken into again. Now, 5 nights later, the guard heard someone breaking in. He got his shotgun and chased the thieves, firing off a shot. Now, the sheriff was called, and as he approached the warehouse, he was passed by a yellow caddy going at high speed. Guess who had a yellow caddy? The roads were icy, so he had to take care chasing the car, and he eventually lost it. Later, he heard that Ken McElroy was in hospital getting shotgun pellets taken out of his arse. Now, Ken was arrested, and he was to be charged with theft. The warrants for his arrest were never acted on, and nothing came of the charges. Now, to say that McElroy was a womanizer is probably not that accurate. Yes, he always got the ladies' attention wherever he went, and he did pride himself on getting into the wealthy farmers' wives' pants, but he was much more interested in very young girls. At one time, he was hanging out with a couple of 17-year-old girls and remarked that they were safe, as they were too old for him. And he added that I liked my women young and tender. I liked that young meat. He was known to seek out 12, 13 and 14-year-old girls, primarily to have sex with them. He would groom them, buy them things, candy, ice cream, whatever. He'd pick them up from school, drop them off at the bus. He would gain their trust and then have sex with them. Any parents that confronted him over it would be threatened and they'd really back right off. There were rumours that he raped a 14-year-old girl who got pregnant, and she died because she couldn't afford to go to hospital to have the twins she was carrying. A year later, he went back to the house and raped her sister. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about McElroy's wives. It's not a deep dive episode, but what I will tell you is relevant to the way he treated people, women in particular. Basically, he took what he wanted, when he wanted, and don't try to stop him. At age 18, McElroy married Alida Marie Marley Holland, who was age 17 at the time, on June the 16th, 1952. Now, later, he started hanging out with a 15-year-old girl called Sharon. Now, Sharon fought with him one night in the truck, and he threatened her with a shotgun if she didn't shut the fuck up. The shotgun went off and the pellets tore open part of her chin. He would get charged over this, but he would ultimately get away with it. To get out of the charges of assault with a deadly weapon, he divorced Alita and married Sharon. Now, this wouldn't be the last time he would do this to get out of charges. They had a kid and then another. He would beat her and lock her in the house. She soon learned that to avoid a beating, she just did whatever he said. McElroy then found a new girlfriend, 14-year-old Sally. He brought her to the house to live with him and Sharon. Now, he had sex with them both and beat them up again if they didn't do what he told them to do. The sheriff finally went to lay charges, and I am cutting this story short, for beating Sally up, but Ken sweet-talked her and she didn't sign the required papers to bring charges against him. Now, she was scared to leave him, but she did eventually get up enough courage and fled to live with a foster family. But McElroy tracked her down and took her back. Now, the way he took her back was to threaten the foster family to abduct his daughter, and then he'd make a swap. Now, that's the sort of mentality this guy's got. So, when he got her home, he beat the hell out of her. Now, Sally had 3 kids to Ken. Then Sharon had another 3. Both Sally and Sharon were at one time both in the hospital at the same time having McElroy's babies. Sally then moved away after her father died. She sort of lost interest and she ended up giving the kids up for adoption. Now, another woman or girl in McElroy's life was Alice Wood, who was involved with him for 20 years and had 3 kids to him. Now, she'd been beaten untold times by McElroy. She loved and she hated him. She even dreamed of killing him with his own guns. Now, Alice she got over him when the sex and violence had finally become enough. She did say, though, that he was a good father to his children. And then we get to Trina. Now, she was his fourth wife. Now, when she was 14, McElroy started seeing her, and by seeing her, he's having sex with her. He would end up being charged with raping her. However, she disputes being raped, but it's statutory rape anyway. What actually happened was that he was charged with raping her, but then tried to marry her as she already had her first child with him. So this is a couple of years after she first met him. Now, Trina's parents, who had to give permission as Trina was still only 17, they refused McElroy. Now, in true McElroy style, who was married at the time, he got a divorce, a house burnt down. Trina's parents finally gave permission and they both went to a nearby county to get married. Now, by the way, the house that burnt down was Trina's parents and the rape charges were dropped because he was now married to the victim. Now, Trina would have 2 more kids to McElroy. Now, bringing the total of his children to around 15, I don't know the exact number, but around 15, it could be more, probably was. She would be with him until the end and often backed him up or covered his back, wielding her own shotgun. Now, I haven't mentioned too many dates tonight. There isn't much point. This mongrel, from his early years onwards until his death, every day through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, he was either stealing, raping, physically or emotionally abusing, grooming, and this rape and abuse was either some young 12 to 14-year-old girl or his very young wives. It was constant. He never backed off. If his wife pissed him off, he would beat her, and it didn't take much to piss him off. If you crossed him in a town or at a bar, you could expect to be stalked for days, with him parked out the front of your house for hours at a time, and he would always be armed. He had a rifle rack in the back window of his truck. If he was raping your underage daughter and you told him to leave her alone, you would be threatened and you'd be stalked. No one said no to Ken McElroy. He did as he pleased. His violence and intimidation wouldn't stop until he died in 1981. Now, as I mentioned before, with his income from cattle rustling, stealing pigs and antiques, he was able to retain a very good lawyer, Richard McFadden. Now, McFadden was known as a mob lawyer who claimed McElroy was the perfect client. He did as he was told, and he always paid cash. Now, in order to keep the podcast from going into 10 episodes on this guy, and it easily could, I want to go over just a couple of main incidents that stand out. Now, I really do suggest you read Harry N. McLean's book, In Broad Daylight, for the deep dive. It's absolutely shocking what Ken McElroy got away with. So, other than the way he treated his wives and women, or really I should be saying these little girls he was hanging out with, there were a few others that we need to talk about. There's Richard Sarge Stratton. Now, Stratton was the only cop that McElroy feared and respected, although that didn't stop him sticking a shotgun in the face of Richard's wife one day when she was sitting in her car. Now, Stratton had no qualms about pulling McElroy over. He did it many times. Now, McElroy threatened him with a shotgun on one of these encounters. You see, Stratton pulled McElroy over one day because his car was riding low at the back. On inspection, there were 4 pigs in the boot, or the trunk. Now, Stratton asked Ken if he'd stolen them. Now, next thing you know, Stratton had a shotgun in his face and he thought out there, hey, okay, I'll back off at the moment. But Stratton, though, rather than back off entirely and avoid McElroy like everyone else did, he spent a lot of his time keeping track of him. Now, he just basically found out what he did and where he went. Now, Stratton was seen as the only cop in Nottoway County that had the gonads to stand up to McElroy. Then we get to the town marshal, Dave Dunbar. He was brought in to keep some law and order in town as there was no official police presence there. He wasn't brought in for McElroy, just the dude that hangs around town, stop the kids doing stuff, all that sort of stuff. Now, he had no police training and had to buy his own gun if he chose to have one. However, he would get his ammo paid for. He took the marshal job more of a lark than anything else. He was paid $240 a month for his efforts. He had no idea at the time about McElroy and his antics, but it wouldn't take long before he found out. McElroy would scare the badge right off of Dunbar, but we'll get to that in a minute. Then there's the farmer, Romaine Henry, that McElroy shot twice with a shotgun after Henry challenged him for shooting weapons on his property, and we will also get to that in a minute. Finally, the last major character in this saga is Ernest Bo Bowenkamp. Now, Bo had moved to Skidmore and he ran a local grocery shop with his wife, Lois. Now, he's almost 70 when the shit would eventually hit the fan, and he and his wife became targets of Ken McElroy, and literally, they would become targets. Okay, so let's get back to Romaine Henry, the farmer. In 1976, he encountered McElroy on his property. Now, Clifford Romaine Henry, he was born July 18th, 1935 in Skidmore. Now, Romaine was a 1953 graduate of Skidmore High School and was a farmer. He served his country in the US Army and was a member of the Maitland-Graham American Legions, the Skidmore Masonic Lodge, and the Claremont Baptist Church. So, on July 27, 1976, McElroy was shooting his gun on Romaine's property. Now, Henry got in his old truck to investigate. When he saw it was McElroy's truck on the side of the road, he decided, I'm going to just let this go. Before he could turn his truck around, McElroy stood in the front of the road with a shotgun. Now, Romaine stopped and McElroy opened his door. He then said, and this is McElroy, "Were you the dirty son of a bitch over at my place in a white Pontiac?" Now, Romaine, he was pretty confused and scared. Now, he was looking down the barrel of McElroy's shotgun and he said, "Look, I don't know anything about any white Pontiac." Then McElroy replied, "You're a lying son of a bitch." He lowered the shotgun, boom, and he fired. The shot blasted a huge hole in Romaine's stomach and blood splattered all over the driver's door. McElroy reloaded his gun and shot again, this time at Romaine's face, hitting him in the forehead and the cheek. Romaine jumped out of the car hoping to get a chance to run off, but then McElroy's gun jammed, giving him a chance to get back in the truck and speed off, but McElroy was in hot pursuit. Finally, McElroy backed off and Romaine was able to make it home, where he told his wife what happened and he ended up going to hospital. Now, McElroy was arrested the next day and charged with feloniously assaulting Romaine with intent to kill or do great bodily harm. Now, McElroy, he just said he wasn't there and that Romaine must have been mistaken. McElroy had 2 witnesses that swore he was at home at the time. He'd always find someone to alibi him. Although 3 people, they did see him in the immediate area at the time of the shooting, but funny enough, after intimidation from McElroy, they suddenly wouldn't give evidence. Now, Richard McFadden, McElroy's lawyer, was able to keep stretching out the case so that after 3 years, Romaine finally gave up and McElroy was acquitted. Now, Romaine estimated that McElroy parked out the front of his place in those 3 years over 150 times. Now, this was his MO. Cross him and he will stalk and intimidate you for days, weeks and years. He would never give up. In fact, you didn't even have to cross him personally. Even if you showed support for someone who he was unhappy with, you yourself could become the target of his intimidation. In Romaine's case, because he gave up over the constant delays in the case, there was no case as he was the last witness standing. Okay, so now it's time to get to the part where this all kicks off and everything goes ballistic. 6 foot 5 inch, 220 pound or 110 kilo Ernest Bo Bowenkamp. He was 69 when he ran a small general store in Skidmore. Now that's just around the corner from a place called the D&G Tavern. Now, you'll see the map. I've got some photos. The shop was staffed by Lois, Bo's wife, and 20 years his junior. There was Evelyn Sumi, who was behind the checkout counter, and Bo ran the meat section up the back. Now, Lois did the books, all the ordering, the administration, all the tax sort of stuff. At the rear of the shop was a room that backed out onto a loading dock, and from the loading dock, you could see the back and side of the D&G Tavern. Now, Bo was pretty easygoing, while Lois was bossier and more assertive. Now, at around 2 p.m. on April the 25th, 1980, at the Bowenkamp's general store, 2 girls walked in, one a teenager, school-aged, and a small child around 4 years old. They wandered around the shop for a while, then went to the checkout to pay. Now, the teenager had a candy bar, a sack of cookies, and asked for a pack of smokes. Now, the little kid had some bubble gum and a jawbreaker. Now, Evelyn rang up the candy bar, cookies, and the smokes when the teenager said, "Here's the money for the candy bar and smokes," and Evelyn, assuming she was going to split the order, she cancelled it, then rang up just those 2 or 3 items. When Evelyn then asked about the bubblegum and jawbreaker, the teenager replied that she's got her own money. When it looked like the child wasn't going to pay, the teenager grabbed the jawbreaker and gum and put them back on the shelf and took her to walk out. As they were going out, the child grabbed the bubblegum again as she was about to walk out the shop when Evelyn shouted, "Ma'am, she still has the candy in her hand." The child started chucking a tantrum. They left. Now, Lois, hearing the noise, came up to the front of the store as the door opened and a third older girl came in. Now, Lois noticed the girl was Tammy McElroy, Ken's kid. The other girl that had been in the shop before was Debbie McElroy. Now, Lois asked what was up and Tammy replied she wanted her money back and dropped the items her sister had paid for on the counter. Now, Tammy then said that whoever was working here had accused her little sister of stealing from the store. Now, Evelyn tried to explain what had went on, that the kid had sort of just grabbed the stuff as she'd left, so that's why she made a bit of a fuss, like, hey, she hasn't paid for it. But it didn't matter because Tammy just didn't want to listen. Now, Lois, she tried to work something out. Things were getting a little bit heated. And Tammy said, "Nobody accuses my little sister of stealing." Now, this went on for a bit and Tammy stormed out saying no one in her family would ever buy anything from the shop again. Now, Evelyn refunded that money and she restocked the shelves with everything they brought back. Lois went outside to get a look at the other 2 girls, just get a better look at who these people are. And this really pissed them off when they saw her. The 3 girls returned to the store and started on Lois, and Evelyn told them that she hadn't accused her sister of raiding the store. But Tammy replied, "Yes, you did," and they again stormed out of the store. Now, McElroy was pissed off when he found out what had happened. Just 20 minutes after the incident at this store, He walked through the front door with a knife in his hands, cleaning his nails. He asked what went on earlier in regards to his daughter and the candy. Bo told him to put the knife away, but McElroy replied, "No one tells me what to do." Trina was with McElroy and started hurling abuse at Evelyn and Lois. "I want to know which one of you fucking bitches accused my fucking kid of coming in this fucking store and raiding it." I hope that doesn't offend anyone, my accent. "I'm going to take one or both of you bitches out this store and into the street and whip your fucking asses off." Now, Lois and Evelyn, they were more shocked at Trina's language than McElroy and his knife. Now, Evelyn tried to explain what happened, but Trina was just going ballistic. They just didn't want to know about it. McElroy told Trina to shut up while Evelyn tried to explain what went on. Now, Trina started on again, and then McElroy asked for a pack of smokes, but Lois said that Tammy had told her that they weren't going to buy from her shop ever again. He turned with Trina and said, "That's right," and they walked out the shop. No smokes. Wonder where they got the smokes from. Probably the survey. Now, Lois and Bo thought that that'd just be the end of it, but Evelyn wasn't so sure, and she was pretty much right. McElroy began stalking the Bowenkamp family. A few days after the incident in the shop, McElroy was waiting outside at closing time. Now, bizarrely, he offered Lois $100 to fight Trina in the street. Now, of course, Lois, she just declined this, didn't want to know about it, thought he was being an idiot. And her and Bo closed the shop and they went home. McElroy didn't like Lois, you see, being a woman, and she was standing up to him. And he had no respect for Bo, as he thought that Bo was letting Lois boss him around. And in McElroy's world, men were the boss. Later that day, McElroy in one truck, Trina in a second, and a third with Tammy driving, did laps around Bo and Lois's house. All three had rifles in the gun racks of the truck. Now, later, McElroy parked his truck out the front of their house, pulled up the bonnet as if he'd broken down, and would look at the house and up and down the street. Now, Lois called the cops and McElroy drove off. You see, McElroy's got radios in his truck so he could hear everything the cops were doing, and the cops, not wanting a confrontation with McElroy, they would make it very clear what they were doing to give McElroy time just to move off. When the police turned up and Lois told them she was worried that McElroy had parked out the front, they told her that they couldn't do anything about it. They left, and then who turns up? About an hour later, he's back out the front of the house doing the same thing. Now, this would go on and on. One night, he turned up and not only fired his shotgun in the air, but also over the top of the house. Now, things were starting to escalate, and there was no point calling the police. Lois and Bo were just on their own. Now, Lois did go to the sheriff's office after the shotgun thing and reported the incident, but nothing ever came of it. Now, remember, this is all over the misunderstanding in the shop when McElroy's 4-year-old daughter wanted a lolly or a candy and wasn't going to pay for it. McElroy did this again with a shotgun a few days later, firing shotguns outside Bo and Lois's house before driving off. Now, later that night, he drove back and then shot into the house several times. He shot a couple of more times before driving off. Now, Lois the next day, she didn't call the cops. She went and bought her own shotgun. Now, Lois called the marshal, Dave Dunbar, and asked if he could help her. Now, he told her he'd do what he could, and a few days later, he saw McElroy and asked him if he'd been firing shots in public around the place. Now, McElroy denied it, and that night, McElroy, Trina, and Tammy drove their 3 trucks slowly past Dunbar's house to let him know that he shouldn't get involved. On July the 8th, 1980, it was Bo's 70th birthday. Usually the family would get together and celebrate, but this year those celebrations were subdued because of the danger that McElroy posed. Now, Lois and Bo, they shut up shop and went home for a light dinner. Now, after that, Bo went back to the shop a little bit later to let the electrician in to do work on the aircon. Now, Beau noticed McElroy in his truck across the street from the tavern, which gave him a great view of the rear of Beau's shop. McElroy would drive up to the back of the shop and Beau was sitting in a chair on the loading dock. McElroy asked him if he'd called the cops, and Beau replied that he had no reason to. Beau then asked him to leave, as it was private property, and McElroy got mad and told him that no one tells me what to do. McElroy turned and approached 4 young boys that were watching the confrontation. He gave them money and told them to go inside the D&G tavern to buy themselves a drink. Now, they were the only witnesses inside, and now they were in the tavern. McElroy walked back to the loading dock, and when Beau turned around, he was staring down the barrel of a shotgun. Beau flinched as a blast from the gun ripped through the side of his neck. He fell to the ground and started to bleed out. This shot was heard inside the tavern, and the barman quickly locked the front and back doors as everyone inside just went quiet, hoping McElroy didn't come in because they all knew it was him. One of the boys that had been given money to buy a drink, though, he ran out the back and up to Beau's shop. He saw Beau lying in a pool of blood. He raced back to the tavern and called an ambulance. Now, Marshal Dunbar was called and he went to the shop. McElroy wasn't there, but Dunbar called the police. They attended to Beau and waited for help. Now, Beau was able to tell him who shot him, and Dunbar, well, he pretty much already knew who shot him. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was a crowd of about 30 or so people at the shop. Now, I reckon it's around this time where the townspeople were starting to have had enough of Ken McElroy. Now, luckily, Beau survived as all the pellets had missed vital arteries, and it was only him flinching when he saw the shotgun that's what saved him. The local cops and Marshal Dunbar were not going to be much help. They took crime scene photos and got some of the pellets out of the wall from the shotgun as evidence. They also interviewed witnesses, but just by chance, Richard Sarge Stratton, that cop, the only one that McElroy feared, had been listening into the radio, and he heard something about a shooting in Skidmore. Now, he knew who it was already, and he knew that McElroy would be listening in to the police radio as well. He jumped into his patrol car, filled it with fuel, and went off in pursuit. He knew where the other police were going to try to head off the fleeing McElroy, but Stratton, who had studied McElroy, he had a hunch on where he would go. He knew he had to get between McElroy and the Missouri River. He sped out of the driveway and said, "I'm coming for you now, you son of a bitch." Now, he knew McElroy would head south and try to cross the border at Atchison, Leavenworth or Kansas City and stay out of the state until things cooled down a bit. Now, as you can see by the photos, Stratton raced north up Highway 29, then turned onto CC. He then turned west onto 59 and stopped at the intersection of 59 and H. Now, listening into the radio chatter, he decided to go north towards Fillmore on H, but he kept this to himself as he knew where the other cops were and he knew McElroy was listening. So the other cops were sort of around that area, not there. He knew McElroy was listening and he's going to come straight down the middle. Now, as he entered Fillmore and crossed A, he saw McElroy and McElroy saw him pretty quick. He found him so fast. You see, on the map where the blue line is, Stratton's going north and meeting McElroy going south. He's in the red and the little cross is where they met. Now, Stratton did a U-turn and followed McElroy, who had Trina in the truck with him. Now, Stratton followed closely and called in for backup, knowing that taking on McElroy alone was going to be a very dangerous thing. Now, with backup on its way, McElroy, who could hear the radio chatter, turned onto a dirt road. Now, Stratton sensed he was doing this to luring off the main road where the backup cars might not find them. He knew he had to pull him over quickly, and he did. He grabbed his shotgun and very carefully approached the truck. He knew McElroy was dangerous, but he also knew Trina was just as much a threat. Now, by the time backup arrived, McElroy and Trina were both under his control. Now, not long after Stratton had arrested and booked McElroy, Trina was released as she hadn't been there at the time of the shooting of Bo. 10 minutes after she was released, Stratton's wife, Margaret, got a phone call and the caller said, "Something bad's going to happen to your husband. He's not going to live until the trial." So that's 10 minutes after she's let go. She's called one of McElroy's friends. McElroy's friends has rung Stratton's wife, Margaret, threatening her. Now, McElroy was charged with felony assault in the first degree. He was bailed to appear August the 18th for his preliminary hearing. Now, on the afternoon of July 9th, 1980, the day after Bo had been shot, the town was abuzz with stories of the night before. Now, you can then imagine how shocked they were when McElroy, with Trina by his side, turned up at the D&G Tavern, sat down and ordered drinks. Here's this guy that had tried to murder an innocent old unarmed man by shooting him with a shotgun less than 24 hours before, it was just the day before, was now sitting in a bar just metres away from the crime scene drinking a beer as if nothing had happened. I think also this is another time that the townspeople as a collective have realised that by ignoring McElroy all these years and turning a blind eye to whatever he did in the hope that he wouldn't turn on them was not the way to go, as it could be you really next and for no reason at all. Now, the local church minister had stopped by the house to see Bo after his release from hospital about a month after the shooting. And that very night, he and his family were targeted by McElroy and Trina. The minister from that night on started packing heat and he kept packing it right up until the very end. Now, one phone call he got described what was going to happen to him. Now, this is pretty foul, what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it. So, I don't know, trigger warning, or if you don't like swearing or filthy filth, just a warning. He said, "If you keep on minding other people's business instead of your own, we're going to rape your wife in front of you. Then we're going to cut your little boy's sex organs off and make him eat them while you watch. We're then going to tie you up and cut him into little pieces. And then all of us are going to fuck your wife in front of you. And then we're going to kill her." A couple of months after the shooting, Marshal Dunbar was at the D&G. As he was leaving, he heard a voice. "Hey, Dave, come over here for a moment. I want to talk to you." Now, it was McElroy, and Dunbar was thinking, fuck, here we go, what's he want? McElroy said, "Are you going to testify against me?" Dunbar said, "I have to, it's my job." McElroy replies with, "I'll kill anyone who put me in jail for the rest of my life." Now, the next thing you know, Dunbar's staring down the barrel of a shotgun, but he was able to sort of grab it and hold the end of it and point it away from his face. He then could feel cold steel on the back of his neck. Now, this was Trina with her shotgun. Dunbar reported the incident to the sheriff, but all he was told to do was just keep an eye on him. Now, Dunbar was a bit pissed off that this was the sheriff's response, and the next morning he walked into the gas station, which had been converted to the city hall, and he laid his badge on the table. $240 a month wasn't worth it as long as McElroy was in town. Now, McElroy went about as usual, intimidating witnesses, hoping there would be no case against him. Now, at this stage, he'd gone to court 19 times, and each time his lawyer was able to get him off. Now, usually there would be no witnesses left after McElroy had scared them off, and there would be no witnesses, no case. Now, this time, things would be a little different. At the preliminary hearing, it would be found that there was enough evidence for a trial to go ahead. Now, McElroy would get into trouble before his trial when a small accident in the truck would see him putting shotguns into the faces of other people. He would be charged, but again get off, as the people he pointed the gun at, after complaining about him, they'd be too scared to testify against him. He would again be acquitted. Now, that would make 20 times that he got off charges. McElroy continued to stalk the wife of the cop who arrested him, Margaret Stratton. He even pulled up to her house when he knew her husband was at work and sat there with a shotgun pointed out the driver's window at her. Now, the constant stalking and intimidation only stopped when Richard Stratton told a crim that McElroy was associated with. He told this crim that he had plans to get McElroy alone one night and blow him away. Now, McElroy only respected Stratton. He knew he'd probably do it, so he then backed off. McFadden, McElroy's lawyer, tried to stretch out this trial date as much as he could, hoping that old Beau would die or forget what happened. Eventually, McElroy went to trial. Now, to cut a long story short, he would be found guilty of assault with intent to kill, to the relief of not only the Bowen camps, but also the township of Skidmore. But to everyone's horror, later that day, McElroy waltzed into the D&G tavern, armed with an assault rifle with bayonet, and sat down for a drink, making threats of what he was going to do to 70-year-old Beau. I mean, fuck's sake. They released him pending an appeal on his conviction. Well, this did shake up the community. Finally, after 21 court cases, McElroy had been found guilty, and yet here he was, sitting at the bar doing what he did best, threatening people while carrying a gun. On July the 10th, 1981, the townspeople of Skidmore met at the Legion Hall in the centre of town with the sheriff to discuss how to protect themselves from this monster, Ken McElroy. Now, while this was going on, McElroy drove into town and went for a drink at the D&G tavern. Now, when the townsfolk heard he was at the tavern, they all left and walked towards it. The sheriff, he got in his patrol car. He just left. He just got out of town. Now, the group of maybe 60 or so residents, they filled the tavern. McElroy got up, bought a six-pack and left the beer. Now, Trina had been waiting for him in the truck parked out the front. As McElroy sat in his truck and was about to start the engine, a shot rang out and McElroy was hit in the head. Then another shot and another, all from several directions. Now, Trina was dragged out of her side of the truck, covered in brain and blood, screaming. Now, McElroy, the town bully, the coward, the pedophile and thief, was dead. No one even called an ambulance. No one cared. And when the investigation started, no one saw anything. Ironically, the only witness was Trina, and her statement carried so little weight that eventually, and to this day, no one has been charged over her husband's killing. Trina would eventually file an unlawful death suit against the town and others, including Del Clement, who she claimed was one of the shooters, but it would be settled out of court for just $17,000. So, Islanders, what a case. How a whole town was terrorised by one man for decades it's just almost beyond belief. But McElroy, he had the ability, bit by bit, over many, many years to instill fear in anyone who dared cross him. And not by his physical strength, because he was nothing but a coward. He would use guns and knives. The way he went about his intimidation was to go after anyone who might try and help out the targets of his abuse. Now, this meant that the townspeople would often turn a blind eye when he went after someone in the fear that they would be the next target. But finally, after he tried to kill old Beau and he was back drinking the next day after being arrested, and then back drinking the day after being found guilty of the intent to kill charges, the town finally stood up to him where the law couldn't. Now, I'm no fan of vigilante justice, but fuck's sake, they had no choice. You can imagine what would have happened if he'd gone to prison for a few years. What would have happened when he got out? Trina, now, I am in two minds over her. First, she was just a kid when McElroy first groomed her, but by the end, she was just as bad as him. So what do you think? Comment below on Trina. Well, she died of cancer in 2012. The lawyer I won't say anything other than what a piece of shit he was. So it was a bit longer this episode than I thought it would be, but a lot shorter than it could have been. I just had to leave out so much. I really suggest you read In Broad Daylight by Harry N. McLean. Now, I got it on Kindle and eventually got the Audible add-in for it. It's about 13 hours reading and it really will shock you. It is a deep, deep dive into Ken McElroy's depravity. Okay, so that's it for this week, the end of another episode. Now, if you want to support the island, there are links in the description for Patreon, PayPal and merch. Please feel free to comment, like and subscribe, and I would really appreciate if you want to share the channel. It's up to you. Hit the bell if you want to be notified for future episodes, because the YouTube gods don't like my channel. I swear too much, okay? So any help is truly appreciated to get more people onto the island. Well, that's about it. I've been your host, Cambo. You've been watching True Crime Island, and as I always say, don't forget to delete your browser history. Good night. Boom fuckalunga.